Hello, I am petroonishchuk. This video about PostRequest and SwiftUI. In this video, we make PostRequest by using escaping clauses and also by using async away method. For make our PostRequest, I will be using this free IP. Link for this IP I put below in description. I will make this PostRequest, will be send this data and receive this data, and display this data in our application. And also, I will make our PostRequest with local server. I will create local server with Go language and show you how you can make PostRequest with your local server. Okay, for start I must create a new project. And first I will be create a model for our application and also extension for date formatter. For example, first you can see I create a new project, URLSession and PostRequest async away 01. First we create extension. We create extension for date formatter. I'll be using this extension where I will be decoding our data, what will be received from the server. I will be using this extension where I will be decoding our data, what I will be received from our server, for decoding this data. And also I create a user file. Inside our user file we have couple structure. First structure is user form. We will be using this structure for data what will be sent to our server, and server must check this data and send our data back. We'll be using this structure for creating data for our request. This structure for send this data. And also we have a structure user for display data what we receive from our server. We will be using this structure for decoding data from our server, for decoding this data. This coding keys for decoding our data will be, how you can see, will be assigned value from JSON key create 8 to property date create to this property. And also we have a new my request error. We'll be using this enum for work with error in our application. Okay, we start our project and also we create our model. Next, what I want to create our network service class. Inside our network service class, we will have a method for make our post request with escaping clauses, with async away method, and also for make our post request to local server. For example, And now you can see I create a new file, NetworkPOSTRequest. Inside this file we have our NetworkPOSTRequest class. With this class we will make our post request. Inside our class we have a couple methods. For create our post request with escaping clauses, for create our post request with async await, and also for create our post request by using async await and escaping clauses, and also for make our post request with our local server. Let's start with first method. First method is create our post request by using escaping clauses. Escaping clauses can outline the scope of our function. That means inside our function, process can run in background thread, and on the end, when our process will be completed, we can run our escaping clauses. That means our escaping clauses give us ability to run our process asynchronously. And on the end, when we run our escaping clauses, we can return our process from the background thread to the main thread. In our post request function, how we can see, first we create our URL by using URL component. Next we create our URL request, and also how you can see, we must set our HTTP method to post because we make our post request. And then you can see we encode the data to send this data to our IP. We encode the data user form. This is our parameters, user form. We will fill these parameters in our application. And then we will encode this data and set this data like HTTP body to our request. If we have an error, we catch an error. Next, we're using our URLSession.shared.dataTask. This function have escaping clauses. This means after dataTask function is completed, this means our dataTask function don't load data or have an error, our escaping clauses return three types of values: data, response, and error. First we start with check an error. If we have an error, we return an error. Next we check our response, and also we check value of our response. If we have value starts from 200 to 299, it's okay. If we don't have this value, that means we have an error. And we run our completion handler with failure result. For failure result, we put our myRequestError, server-side error with response, and we put value of our status code from our response. Next, if our status code is okay, we check if we have a data. And next, if we have a data, we try to decode our data. First, we create our decoder. Next, we set our data decoding strategy to our decoder to decode data what we receive from our API. For this, we're using our custom formatter extension. How you can see, we create this extension for decoding this type of data. And after we set our data decoding strategy, we try to decode our data by using decoder and try to decode our data to user object. And if our decoder is not successful, that means we have an error. And we put in our completion handler failure result with decoding error. But if our decode is successful, we using our completion handler and using successful result with value response and new user. And also don't forget set resume on the end of our URLSession.shared.dataTask function. This is give us ability to run dataTask function in URLSession. Okay, this is our method for create our post request by using escaping clauses. Next, we have our method for create our post request by using async await method. We create our function. This function takes one parameter, user form. This parameter will be used for encode our data and send for our API. And also you can see we use async. This means this is our async function. This means our function can run asynchronously. And also we have throw. That means our function can throw an error. And on the end, if all successful, we must return value, HTTP URL response, and user object. Inside this method, we also create our URL by using URL component. Next, we create our request. Next, we try to decode our data for send this data to our API. If we have an error, we throw an error. In previous example, we using completion handler. In previous example, how we can see, when we have an error, we using completion handler and take type of our result failure and set for this failure type of our error. Because our escaping clause can return result with value, HTTP URL response and user object and also an error. If we tap failure, that means we send this error. If we tap success, that means we send value. If we tap success, this means we set value, HTTP response and user object. With async method, when we have an error, we throw an error. If all successful, we return this value. How you can see, we try to encode our data for send this data to our IP. We send this data to our HTTP body. If we have an error, we throw this encoded error. And next, we use it data for function from our URL. This is async await method. And how you can see, we use it try await and try to run this method by make our request. And when we run this method and we have an error, this means this function throw an error. If all successful, this means we must have a data and response. Then we check our response. We check our status code and value of our status code. And next, if status code is successful, we try to decode our data what we take from our IP. We create our decoder, we set our decoder strategy to our decoder for decode type of date of our data what we take from our IP. And then, how you can see, we try to decode our data. We use decoder and try to convert our data what we receive from our IP to user object. And if all successful, we return value, response, and also new user object. If we have an error, we throw an error. This is our method for make our post request by using async await method. And also this method can throw an error because we write this method as throw. Next, I create a method for run our escaping clauses by using async await method. How you can see, I created async function, and also this function called throw error. If all successful, we return value, HTTP URL response, and URL. For run our escaping clauses, we must use two-try catch block. Inside our two-try catch block, we try to run our escaping clauses by using with check throwing condition. Throwing means this method can throw an error. And we try to run our escaping clauses by using one parameter user form. And at the end we have an result. Result means what return our escaping clauses. Our escaping clauses can return an error and also can return value. That means it's all success. And we check our result. If all successful, we return our URL response and also new user object. That means we use our conditional type resume and we return our value, URL response, and also new user object. We return this value. And when we have an error, we take this error and use it conditional.resume throw this error because our method is throw. If we have an error, in this case, we throw an error here. Okay, this is our method for run our escaping clauses by using async await method. And on the end, I also create method for run our post request with our local server. How you can see, our function user post request localhost take one parameter user form. In this example, we're also using user form for send this data to our local server. And also, I create async throw. This means this is async function, and throw means this function can throw an error. And if all successful, we return HTTP URL response and user object. Next is all very similar. First we create our URL, next we create our URL request, next we try to encode our data from our user form. If we have an error, we throw an error. And then we try to make our request by using our request and data for function from our URLSession.char. This is data for function is async function. And how you can see, for run this function, we use it try await. When we try to run this function and we have an error, we throw an error. If we don't have error, we check our response, status code of our response, and also we check an error message. Because when we work with localhost in our post request and try to set an error in our localhost, we can set an error by using value of our status code. For example, we can send value 400, and also we can send a message with this error. And here we check if we have a message, what we send with our error. If we have a message, we print this message. And at the end, we throw our error by using myRequestError and null server-side error with response if value of our response. And on the end, how you can see, we create a decoder for decode our data. We set date decoder strategy for decode type of data from our data what we receive from our API. And also, how you can see, I create decoder for decode data what we receive from our local server. And also, we set date decoder strategy for decode type of data what we receive from our local server. And next, we try to decode our data by using decoder and try to decode this data to a new user object. And if all successful, this means we return value response and also we return our new user object. If we have an error, we catch this error and throw this error. And now you see, I show you all methods what I will be using for make our post request by using escaping clauses, async await method, escaping callers and async await, and also method for work with our local server. And now I must create a view model for run our method from our NetworkPOSTRequest class, and also I must create a view for display a data in our application. After all this create, I try to explain how all it works. For example, How you can see, I create PostRequestViewModel and also I create couple view. Detailed user view, user PostRequest view, and also local user PostRequest view. Let's see our view model. Inside our view model, we have couple property. First property, fulfill our name and job where will be make our post request. And also we have property main user. This property will be hold user object. This object will be hold information what we receive for our IP. And also we create property NetworkPOSTRequest for work with our NetworkPOSTRequest service. And next, how you can see, we create couple functions for work with our PostRequest service. First method what we have, make form user request. For this method, we will be create our user form object. We take value from our name property and also we take value from our job property and try to delete our white space and new line from name of this property. And at the end, we return our user form object. Next, we have our method for run our post request from our NetworkPOSTRequest class. First, we run our post request with escaping closure. We run this function, and inside this function, we try to run our user post request escaping from our NetworkPOSTRequest server. And also, for our user form parameters, we use make form user request method. This method returns our user form object. And on the end, after user form request escaping is completed, we have end result. And we check our result. If our result is successful, we return our value, response, and new user. And then we assign this new value to our main user property in our main queue. And if we have an error, we print an error. Next method for run our user post request is async away. How you can see, inside this method we using two try catch block because our user post request async away can throw an error. And inside our two block we try to run our user post request method from our NetworkPOSTRequest server. For our user form, we also using make form user request method. And the end, if all successful, we assign a new value to our main user property. If we have an error, we print an error. How you can see, in this time we don't write dispatch main queue because we create our view model main actor. This means after we run our post request and take value from our post request by using our user post request async away method and try to assign new value to our main user property, our method return to the main queue because we make our view model is main actor. Next, we run our user post request with escaping and async away. In this method, we try to run our method from our NetworkPOSTRequest service. We try to run method user post request escaping a second away. And if our post request is successful, we have our response and new user object. If we have an error, we print an error. And if we have our response and new user object, we assign a new user to our main user property in our view model. And then we will display our main user property in our application. And also we print status code from our response. And on the end, we have a method for create our post request with local server. How you can see, for this we also use two try catch block because our user post request local host can throw an error. In this variant, you can see we have the same like in previously example. We try to run our user post request localhost method, and if our post request is successful, we have a response and new user object. And on the end, we assign a new user object to our main user property in our view model. And also we print our response status code. If we have an error, we print an error. And on the end, we have our clean user field. With this method, we will be clean our field for make a new post request. This is our view model. And now I try to run a simulator and show you how look our view and how we can make our post request. For example, and now we run our simulator. First, what we have in our simulator is our main content view. This is our main content view with two links. Link to our user post request and also to our local user post request view. Let's move to our user post request view. Our user post request view will be make post request with our IP in this IP. How you can see, our view have a list. Inside the list we have couple sections. First section is our user data section. We create a separate view for display a data about user. We name name, job ID, and date created. Next section is our text field section. With our text field section, we fill name and job. This two property called our view model. How you can see, we fill our property from our ViewModel name and job. We work with these two properties. This is our text field section. And on the bottom, we have our button section with 3 buttons. First, for make our post request is escaping closure. Inside the section, first button, post request and escaping. With this button, we run our method runUser post request escaping from our ViewModel. How you can see, when we tap to this button, we will be run method from our ViewModel. We will be run method runUser post request escaping. We will be run this method. Next button, post request and async away. How you can see, we try to run our runUser post request method from our ViewModel. And because this method is async, this means we must use it away before run this method. And also we must run this method inside task. When we tap to this button, we run our runUser post request method, async away. We will run this method. And on the third button, we have post request escaping and async away. We will be run method runUser post request escaping and async away. We will run this method. And on the end, we have a button clean user field. How you can see, we have this button for clean our name property, job property, and name user property. And now, when we tap button post request and escaping, we will send this data, what we hold in our text field, to our IP. We will send this name, word field, and also we send a job lead. And now, when we tap to this button, we will display this data in our application. For example, how you can see, when we tap to this button, we receive a data, name, job, ID, and create date. When we tap again, we will be change our ID. This means we take a new user, but with different ID. This means our method, post request and escaping work correct, because we send this data and receive this data. And also our response status code 201. And now I clean user field and try to fill our text field again. And now I try to make post request with async away method. When I tap this button, we run our async away method. And how you can see, we display the value from our IP. That means our method work correct. And on the end, I try to make our post request with async away and escaping. For example, when we run our post request escaping and async away, we also have the data. This means our method work correctly and we display our data in our application. Okay, this is how we can make our post request with our IP and display this data in our application. Next, I try to show you how you can make post request with your local server. For example, on the left side we have our iOS project. On the right side we have our local server. I create local server by using Golang. And now for run our local server, we must type in go run and done. Path of our server must have value 5000. When we make our post request with our local server, our path have value 4000. This URL must be correct. And now let's see what data we must receive when we make our post request with this local server. Let's move to our post user code. This file holds our model and also this file holds our data. First we have our structure user form. This structure holds two properties, job and name. I create very similar structure for make our post request like in our previously IP. We must make request with name and job. And also we create our post user structure. This user will be called name, job, ID and create this data similar like our previously IP. And also, how you can see, we have a property post user. This property holds slice of post user object. And then we will search a specific post user object from our slice of user object and take this object and send to our iOS device. That means we will search our specific user by name and by job. We have different name and different job. Ron, manager, Erica, developer. And we try to make a post request by take value for Erica, for example, with job developer. And now let's move to our server user.go. Inside this file we have our handler user request. This function will be work with our post request. How you can see, the server can take a GET request and also we can take a post request. In this video I will make a post request. And when we take a post request, we try to decode our data, what we receive from our iOS device. we will be decoding our data to our user form with name and job value. And if our decoder is successful, we run our method foundUser to find a specific user what we receive from our iOS device, and we try to find this user in our post-user slice. If we have an error, we return an error. And if we don't have an error and found our specific user, we try to encode this specific user and send this specific user to our iOS device to display this user in our iOS application. If we have an error, we send an error. This is our method for found specific post-user object in our post-user slice. We'll hold our file postuser.go. Will be found our user inside post-user slice. And this is our main file. And when we run our Go application, we run this file. How you can see, for work with our request, we select our handle user function for hold inside our server user.go. How you can see, we set this function for work with our request. And also, this is value from our server. And how you can see, I run this server. And now I run our iOS device. I try to make a post request with different user will hold our local server. For example, this is our main content view. Now move to our view for work with local server. Our view is very similar like we work with our IP. We have name, job, ID, and create date, and also the text field section. And now I try to make our post request with our user, Morpheus, and leader. How you can see, this is our first user in our post user slide. And when we make post request with this user, we must display ID for this user and for this date for this user. For example, how you can see, we display name, job leader, ID 128, and this date. This means our method works correctly. Let's try to another user. For example, Mary, developer. When we try to make our post request with value Mary and job developer, we take this date, Mary, developer, ID, and date create. How you can see, this is this date. This means our post request works correctly. Let's try to another user. Erica, developer. How you can see, when we make our post request with Erica, developer, we take this data, Erica, developer, ID 123, and date create. How you can see, there's the same value. That means our post request worked correctly. And on the end, when I run a simulator, I have an error. I have this error because I make our view model like main actor. And now I change this by delete our main actor from whole view model and set main actor to each method what will be run asynchronously and on the end must return to the main thread. For example, this is the end of my video. In this video, I try to show you how you can make your post request in SwiftUI by using escaping clauses, async away method, and also escaping clauses and async away method together. And also I show you how you can make your post request with local server. In this video, I use local server create by Go language. Link to video where I create server by using Go language I put below in description. And also link to repository with all code I also put below in description. This is the end. Thank you for watching.